Hi, everyone. I'm Bhaskar Sankar, the editor and publisher of Jacobin. We're broadcasting today on an almost surreal and terrible occasion, the passing of my friend and mentor and one of Jacobin's great inspirations and allies, Leo Panitch. Leo died over the weekend at the age of 75. He had recently been diagnosed with cancer. He was ongoing treatment. He was very optimistic about that treatment. Unfortunately, due to complications with COVID, which he contracted when he was at the hospital, he quite suddenly had viral pneumonia and passed away. We had just a few days prior, about 10 days ago, been planning years more of his intellectual output. He was looking forward to time with his grandchildren. He had two of them, two children as well, I believe two grandchildren. And he was also very excited about the possibilities of the Blue Jays signing DJ LeMahieu away from the Yankees, which I was less pleased about. But I first met Leo a decade ago when Jacobin was just getting started. And since then, I had what seems like countless conversations with him over baseball games, once at a jazz club that he dragged me to. I don't really have the air for it, but he was a big connoisseur. Dinners and bars across the world. I especially remember in the days after the 2016 election, when the whole world was rightly talking about Donald Trump, but we spent 6 hours walking around New Belgrade together, debating Tito, the Yugoslav model, self-management, admiring social housing, befriending and having drinks with a few locals. So Leo obviously meant a lot to me at a personal level. I'm not sure if I ever quite communicated that to him, but I certainly communicated his political and intellectual influence. So Jacobin obviously as a publication, as an outlet, we see and reject the dead end of social democracy, which was a big part of Leo's work. But we're also critical of what we see as a dead end of traditional Leninism in advanced capitalist countries. So naturally, we gravitated to the few thinkers of this left of social democracy, socialist movement. Figures like Ralph Miliband and Leo Panitch, chief among them. There were a lot of facets to Leo's work. This isn't meant to be a definitive video. This is obviously very difficult for all of us to do. It's very impromptu. We'll be publishing more serious takes on Leo's work, symposiums on it in the coming weeks and months on the Jacobin website. But before I go on and introduce just a little bit the brief sketch of the biography of Leo and some of his work, I wanted to introduce my two comrades today, Ronan Burtonshaw and Max Shanley. Our friend Katerina Principe couldn't make it, but she sends her regard, and we're going to have her on soon to talk about Leo's work on and a lot of the debates about the new parties of the European left and about European integration. Ronan Burtonshaw is the editor of Tribune. He's also a contributing editor Jacobin. He wrote a wonderful tribute to Leo that's currently on the Tribune website. And Max Shanley is a longtime Labor Party activist. I always joke that he will one day be, if not the leader of the Labor Party, then the powerful figure behind the hopefully next and hopefully not last left-wing leader of the Labour Party. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of the work of Tony Benn and of Labour Party history. He was a very close friend and collaborator with Leo Panitch, someone who Leo trusted on for all the latest news within the party that informed so much of his recent work. And before I turn to them, I just wanted to just briefly, just for those who are not that familiar with Leo and his work, just to give a little introduction to it. So as far as biography, Leo was born in 1945. He was born to a working class immigrant family in Winnipeg. His family had roots, were Jewish immigrants from the Ukraine. He did an undergraduate in economics and political science at the University of Manitoba, but he moved overseas to study at the London School of Economics. and he worked there with Ralph Miliband, who was doing his classic work on state theory, the famed kind of Marxist intellectual. He became very close with Miliband, who was his mentor of sorts. He was actually also named godfather to Ed Miliband, the better of the two Miliband children, who later became a leader of the Labour Party. And they maintained, despite their many political disagreements, a very nice relationship throughout their lives. In 1985, Leo began working as a co-editor of Socialist Register. For those not familiar, Socialist Register is just an annual, but I believe it's the most important Anglophone socialist publication. And I'm the publisher of several Anglophone socialist publications. So I do not say that lightly. And together with his collaborator, Greg Albo, he's been the editor in recent years of Socialist Register, with his frequent co-writer, Colin Lays. He was the editor after Miliband's passing in the 1990s. So just a few rough bits about his work. So there's lots of gaps, like I said in this video. We won't be covering everything on it. But I guess you could say that in the 1970s, a lot of his work was on social democracy and intervening in debates that were happening in Europe, particularly around the meaning of social democracy and its future. In the 80s, in the 90s, a lot of his interventions were around the evolution of the UK Labour Party as it moved to the right, moved towards Blairism, but also had its last real resurgence, at least until Corbyn, under Tony Benn. And if you want to read that work, I highly recommend Working Class Politics in Crisis, which is a fantastic collection. He's probably best known for his work with co-author and best friend since really childhood almost, Sam Gindin, which is The Making of Global Capitalism. It's a fantastic work that deserves its own talk. We actually have a symposium on it that features Jacobin contributors like Mike Beggs and Nicole Ashoff. That's from 2013. It's on the Jacobin site. Everyone should check it out. And then a lot of his more recent work was around the new parties of the European left that emerged since Bloco in Portugal, that emerged throughout the 21st century. He wrote about this. He wrote about things like the Sanders phenomenon and the Corbyn Labour Party in The Challenge and other more recent work. And before I pass it on to Sam and to Max and Ronan to discuss a bit about some of Leo's more contemporary work, I just wanted to give everyone a rough outline of what Leo was thinking and doing in the 1970s. I think these are probably his least known interventions. It's work that I recently started engaging with. Unfortunately, did not have much time to talk to him about it. But in the 1970s, there was this prevailing view among moderate, you could say right-wing European social democrats, that something had fundamentally changed in capitalism, that there was a new model of corporatism that meant that labor was totally integrated within the system. These people argued that the new social democracy in the 1970s, the new welfare states that had been built, the systems of centralized bargaining, had ended the cycle of boom and bust, or at the very least, fundamentally altered the logic of capitalist competition. And along with that, it made class struggle virtually obsolete. Leo was, of course, saying that this was nonsense. He was showing the way in which even centralized bargaining, which at times seemed to benefit workers, were ways for capital to restrict wage demands. And fundamentally, his work was a defense of Marxism, even though he was far from a dogmatic Marxist and sometimes shied away from the what came along with that label. But it was a defense of this Marxist theory of the state, theories of class struggle. And I think it was extremely significant. in the 1980s, a lot of his criticism was of the soft left's evolution into Blairism. He defended often Tony Benn in his insurgent campaigns to fight back against this rightward drift of the Labour Party, which I'm sure Max will get into. But I do think his work on social democracy, his work from the 70s and 80s, has been utterly vindicated by the experiences of the last 30 to 40 years. He saw the trajectory of social democracy. And that's why, including in a recent interview I was able to do with him from January of this year, he posed a type of politics that took social democracy and its gains very seriously, while still not eliding its contradictions. So he was very worried. He wanted to make sure that none of us became Trotskyists, and also that none of us became social democrats. So here we are without a home, neither social democrats nor Trotskyists. And I think a lot of that is thanks to Leo Panitch. There's a lot more of his work from this period, from the 1970s. There's debates with Corbyn, quite an interesting thinker on the meaning of social democracy and its gains and how stable they were. But I guess I'll leave it there on my end and introduce Max Shanley to talk a bit about Leo's engagement with the Labour Party, both in his days at LSE, I guess in the 80s, and also most recently with the Corbyn moment. But thank you, Max. I know it's a difficult thing to do and a difficult day, but I really appreciate you talking with us.
Thanks for having me, Bhaskar. I mean, I think I speak for all of us when I say I'm still in utter shock that, Leo has gone. I was only talking to him via email still about 8 or 9 days ago. Skyped with him a couple of weeks before that. He was in hospital by then, but, he was cheery. He got his diagnosis. He was going to be getting treatment, and then he was going to be going home. And obviously, that never came to pass. And it's the only word that can describe what's happened is it's a tragedy. He was 75 years old, but he was a very young 75-year-old. I think he put a lot of us to shame in terms of his level of fitness.
I think he worried more about our inability to stay out late with him than anything else.
Yeah, many a late night drinking whiskey with him. But just to start going over his work, I mean, you sort of brought it up earlier, the fact that Leo went off to the University of Manitoba and studied economics and political science. And, his first sort of approach to the Marxist tradition was that he read the preface to the Critique of Political Economy, and he leant over to Sam Gindin and whispered in his ear, "I think I'm a Marxist." And I think that's really where it all began. He was involved in and led student strikes whilst he was there. And once he finished his degree, he won a Commonwealth scholarship to London School of Economics. He wrote down on his application form that he wanted to study economic planning. So they put him in a course on public administration, which he found utterly boring. And a fellow student who was equally as bored turned to him and said that he should go and listen to a lecture by this bloke Miliband. And those were the lectures that formed the basis for the state and capitalist society. Leo went up to Miliband afterwards and said, "I'd like to transfer to your course." And Miliband said, "Well, I'm oversubscribed by hundreds, but I'll see if I can squeeze you in." And he did. And his relationship with Miliband ultimately, in his own words, was probably the most important of the political relationships in his life. It's quite interesting. Leo's first book and his final book were both on the Labour Party. His First book was based on his doctoral thesis, which was Labour and the Trade Unions, was the title of the doctoral thesis, but the book was called Labour and Industrial Militancy, and it focuses on the nature of the relationship between the Labour Party and the trade union rank and file, the 1960s Labour government and its incomes policy, and the tension and class struggle that was emerging inside of the party. Afterwards, what followed that period obviously was the rise of the insurgent Benite movement inside the Labour Party, of which Leo became a critical friend and a good friend of its figurehead, Tony Benn. What always impressed Leo about Tony Benn the most was that, unlike most social democratic politicians who come through social democratic parties, where they start on the left and then they get into parliament and they drift off to the right and they become more pessimistic with age, what happened with Ben was in reverse. Ben was radicalised by his period in office, and that turning to the left, and really is what made him a socialist. He became a socialist in spite of the struggles that he had faced inside of the state, rather than kowtowing to them. What really impressed Leo the most was that the fear that Ben shook into the British establishment, both inside and outside of the Labour Party, and the politics that Ben and the Benites represented and articulated gave Leo much food for thought. And whilst he ultimately believed that the Benite insurgency would fail, which it did, as per Miliband's thesis in Parliamentary Socialism, that is that of all parties that claim socialism as its creed, the Labour Party is the most dogmatic, not dogmatic about socialism, but dogmatic in its belief of parliamentarism and its idolation of the British state. And yet, despite all of this, Leo remained encouraging and critical friend. And throughout this period, he wrote, lots of notes of what was going on and kept record of his correspondence with different people, and with the full intention of writing a book on the Ben years and the Kinnockite counter-revolution that followed. But he was quite depressed by the situation, and so he decided to sort of throw the work to one side. And it was around the mid-90s, I believe after Ralph Miliband had died, that his longtime friend Colin Lees told him that, he should revive the project, and together they worked together on a book, and that became the end of Parliamentary Socialism. In the intervening years, the struggle inside of the Labour Party was very much pushed to one side, and so Leo lost contact with much of the Labour left. But then when the Corbyn moment occurred and this mass movement appeared almost overnight, his interest was revived. And strangely, for someone who had spent most of his professional life critiquing social democratic parties, Leo became a surprising, to him at least, popular figure in the party, as both the heir of Miliband's legacy, but also his own work. He couldn't walk through Labour Party conference without being stopped by young activists wanting to talk to their Uncle Leo. Something which he always used to complain, I'm not their uncle, but it was always meant in a term of endearment. He was quite depressed by the 2019 election result, which, as someone who was quite optimistic about our chances myself, he predicted that it wasn't going to go well as early as November that same year. But he was still very optimistic that the Corbyn legacy would live on in the hundreds of thousands of people who had been inspired by a different type of politics. And he went back to the work on of the end of parliamentary socialism, again with Colin Lees, to write an abridged version and an update focusing on the Corbyn years, with Colin Lees again. Colin says that being his final book, he said that, you know, Leo felt that it was a completion of his work. He had done all that he could do. There were still questions that remained, though. We would often talk about a speech that Ben made in 1976, a Labour Party conference, where he raised this issue of the usual problem of the reformer. And if you don't mind, I'll quote it. "We have to run the economic system to protect our people who are now locked into it while we change the system. But if you run it without seeking to change it, then you are locked in the decay of the system. But if you simply pass resolutions to change it without consulting those who are locked into the system that is decaying, then you become irrelevant to the people you seek to represent. We can't content ourselves with only speaking to ourselves. We must raise these issues publicly and involve the community groups because we champion what they stand for. We must win the argument, broaden the debate, broaden the membership, not only to win the election, but to generate the public support to carry those policies through." I think this is a universal question that socialists around the world need to answer. And if there's anything we can do to allow to let Leo's legacy live on, it's to try to answer this question, because he felt it was a political one. Just on a final note before I go, I really love Leo. I first met him 6 years ago. I was working for Ruth Winstone, who was Tony Benn's editor, helping compile a book of Ben's speeches. And I'd read The End of Parliamentary Socialism back from cover to cover multiple times in the previous years, because I'm one of those sad people who always still had a little bit of hope that there might be a left insurgency in the Labour Party in my lifetime. And I got to know Leo because there were speeches in the book that I wanted to include, and because he had taken bits of them and put them in the book, but sadly he didn't have them. Yet we agreed that year we would meet up when he was over in London for the Historical Materialism Conference to launch that year's Socialist Register. This would have been in 2014. And I brought a friend along for the dinner because I was so nervous to meet him, because, you know, I'd read his work and I thought it was so important, and I thought, why is he going to want to talk to me? He's this hotshot Marxist. And one thing I always remember was me and my friend Barnaby, we'd all had the same meal, duck. It's quite funny, actually. Everyone I've spoken to since Leo's died has always brought up food in relation to him, because he loved nothing more than going for a dinner late into the night. But me and Barnaby had finished our food, and being the savages we are, we like to eat with our hands. We wanted to start picking up the bones, chewing them, breaking them up, eating the bone marrow. And we thought, we can't do this in front of Leo Panitch. He's going to think we're a pair of savages. And then he leant down, picked up the bone, broke it in his mouth, and we knew we were all right. And from that day on, me and Leo were friends. I was the one that was giving him the updates on what was going on in Britain when Corbyn rose to office. He didn't believe me, despite the fact that I had an inside line into what the phone banking returns were like, that Corbyn was going to win 60% of the vote. He thought it was all nonsense, and then Jeremy won, and he was, ecstatic. But he warned me, that this had been tried before, and unless we were willing to go beyond the framework of Laborism and all the contradictions that presented us, we ran the risk of failure. But like I said, you know, I love the man. I'm going to miss him every day for the rest of my life. I keep checking my inbox and refreshing it, expecting an email from him saying, do you want to go on Skype for a bit? And to know that that's never going to happen again. And I'm never going to hear his voice other than in old recordings, quite frankly makes me want to cry, but I'm not going to, because that would be a bit embarrassing on camera. But I think the best way of summing him up is how Shakespeare put it best. He was a man, taken for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again.
That's beautiful, Max. I think that captures a lot about Leo. And what I loved about your relationship too is you had such a lovely, touching personal relationship, but also you were just constantly arguing about politics. And I think, if anything, Leo was often very stubborn in his arguments, but he shifted. He shifted a lot of his thinking on the Labour Party and what was possible. And I think, in the end, and correct me if you think this is a mischaracterization, but I believe he thinks that a lot of Corbyn's failures and the failures of the left and Labour Party in recent years were contingent rather than structural. Obviously, the difficulties were structural in nature, but the inability to take harsher and more drastic action to push party reform and so on, which I think is an evolution from his earlier work. But again, I mean, I think the only small consolation that we have as friends of someone who's passed on, like Leo, is that he's left behind this huge body of work for posterity, and that there's going to be future generations of people engaged in politics in the years and decades to come that are going to discover his work and are going to read his words and maybe hear his voice. And for them, it'll be like having a conversation with his thought, engaging with it. And we were lucky enough to be able to both do it with his words and also to know him as the man. But I want to now turn to Ronan to discuss a little bit of some of Leo's more contemporary work, his engagements. He's did a lot of work for Tribune in recent years. I think some of his finest recent work was in the pages of Tribune. Like Ronan mentioned in his tribute, Leo was a bit skeptical, I think, of the process of relaunching Tribune. He was very skeptical of the Tribune tradition, figures like Michael Foot, at some of the role the Tribune played, from being an initial ally of the Benite movement to kind of turning on it briefly, and it's kind of mixed legacy. I think that was the great thing about Leo. He was definitely happy to debate and challenge. But in the end, he made these great interventions in Tribune. He shaped the publication, I think, for the better, and he was on the advisory board in the last year. So I'll let you start wherever you want, Ronan, and maybe we'll get back to some of these debates after.
Yeah. I'm stepping in tonight for Katerina, our mutual friend who knew Leo and his work far better than me, and Katerina will, in her own time, make her tribute, I'm sure, to Leo and his contributions, which will be greater than mine. But I knew Leo for the last number of years, particularly, obviously, since we relaunched Tribune. And as Bhaskar said, that was not something Leo was convinced was the right thing to do. But in the process of our discussions, I learned a lot from Leo's perspective on the Tribune tradition, on the Labour Party and the prospects for its reform, the role that a publication could play within all of that. And I think, in fact, I know that Leo came around more to our way of thinking on a number of questions in relation to the tradition and the importance of having a tradition that you can ground, and particularly a new generation of socialists in, given that this emerging socialist movement in Britain post 2015 was arising through the Labour Party, was happening around the figure of Jeremy Corbyn, that it was particularly important to be able to discuss some of the history of the Labour left, the figures like Nye Bevan and Michael Foot, and yes, Tony Benn, but also to be able to give people a sense of some of the historic and structural problems of the Labour Party, which had run up against the left of the party for generations. Obviously, Max has spoken very well to Leo's understanding of Laborism and his learnings from Ralph Miliband. I'll just say a few more things about that, because I do think, you know, Max's overview has covered it well. And again, a lot of people will write about this and the influence of books like The End of Parliamentary Socialism on them in the coming days and weeks. For me, you know, what I took from Leo's writing about Laborism was an understanding of a class politics, but a particular kind. Leo took from Miliband the understanding of the Labour Party that was formed to defend workers' interests in the political arena, but not necessarily to transcend or to overcome capitalism. In fact, explicitly under most of its leaders, not to transcend or to overcome capitalism. So a kind of a conservative class politics, one that oriented itself around the national interest, and tried to balance the projects, something that, you know, people like even in France as well, Leon Blum would have talked about the difficulty of trying on the one hand to represent the national interest and the workers' interest at the same time. This question was the one that constantly from the earliest stages of the Labour Party confronted its leadership. But also that it had a particularly conservative approach to class struggle itself, was very much tied to a corporatist approach, a partnership approach, and one which was based on the separating of the industrial and extra-parliamentary. So those kind of broader struggles in the trade union movement, in you know, social movements on the streets and so on, that was based on the separation of those from the political. So instead of these things being integrated, where you know, you could politicize the trade unions and bring working class politics in their best form into the parliament, these things were separated. And so you in fact depoliticized the trade unions and kind of professionalized the political sphere, which was meant just to deliver certain outcomes, and but mediating between those two was a kind of trade union leadership, which for many decades in the British context was one which was satisfied that it could gain a certain bargain out of the system, and didn't organize for a more kind of full frontal attack on capital, on its interests, on the way in which it structured the economy. And it was that prism of Laborism that Miliband outlined and that Leo so accurately described in his work. And when you talk about it now, it's interesting. I was reading before this session back over some of Leo's descriptions of the things that the Kinnock's leadership of the Labour Party did, and there's some wonderful parallels between then and now under the Starmer leadership. He talks at one stage about reducing the significance of the National Executive Committee and the unions within the party, emphasising market research and opinion polling instead of mobilising the membership. All things that anyone who, like myself, is a member of the party under Keir Starmer will find very familiar. In some ways, in so far as the Corbyn project did, to some degree, try to mobilise Labour Party's members more than they had been previously, did see itself at least as representing the demands of social movements in Parliament, did have a broader perspective than trying to bargain with the system. In some of those respects, I think you could say that the Corbyn project was a Panitch project, but in many others, I think it wasn't. There is an interesting question, of course, that I only got to broach with Leo briefly, and I wish I'd got to discuss with him more, which is the question of, well, you know, Laborism was not as bad as it could get. I mean, he wrote along with Colin Lees about how Tony Blair was the first genuinely post-Labourist Labour leader, insofar as that, you know, the prospect of this grand bargain, and that's really what the post-war social democratic gains were. They were a class compromise, and Leo very accurately understood that capital didn't need to make that compromise anymore. And it came to the crisis of the 1970s, particularly, that the system and the logic behind the kind of social democratic framework fell away, because capital understood it could go on the offensive and it didn't have to make these bargains, and so it didn't anymore. And what we were left with through the 90s and into the 2000s was actually something, I think, that's post-Laborism, and it's something which comes through to some degree in Leo and Colin's work. But I think it's a fascinating discussion to follow on afterwards, for those of us who've been influenced by what they wrote, which is a kind of social liberalism that actually was quite content to do away with the trade unions and their influence altogether. And to some extent, interestingly, the role of the Corbyn project was to bring back a more radicalized trade union leadership, still one that had its limitations, still one that was not prepared to educate and organize workers to really confront the system, but one that was at least interested in a left government, if not a workers' government, back to the fore, back into some, you know, prominence inside the Labour Party. And that was no bad thing. And that is where I think there is some kind of updating and modernizing to be done around the thesis of Laborism and those discussions that Leo laid out. But where he was absolutely correct was this idea that there is a fundamental debate within the party over managing capitalism versus transcending it. And that debate to some degree runs through the Labour left as well. It's not one that is just defined on Labour right versus Labour left basis. When I look back at the Corbyn experience, before I move on to some broader aspects of Leo Panitch, because as much as he adored the Labour Party, it wasn't the only thing that Leo wrote about. It wasn't actually the first thing that really brought me to Leo's writing. But I think when you look back at what he said, it's unavoidable that he was correct on many cases, and he was correct against the leadership. He was correct against the Corbyn leadership. Decisions and compromises, I would say, that were made by the leader of the opposition office, the leadership of Momentum, the leadership of the trade unions, which in the end have proven to be very, very costly, because they left all of the gains of the past 5 years built on sand to far too great a degree. Questions like mandatory reselection, which Leo always emphasised, and the need to be able to reform the Parliamentary Labour Party, and the fact that the Parliamentary Labour Party was the very core of that idea that he outlined previously of Laborism, of this separation of the political from the industrial and the extra parliamentary. And unless you broke the power of that group of MPs and you made them genuinely accountable to the broader movement, then you would never be able to move forward a socialist programme. And he was absolutely right about that. He was absolutely right that party unity strategies don't work, that the way in which the Labour Party has been changed and reformed over years is that a great crisis happens in the broader society, and a part of that party rises to the top. Obviously, most recently, when you think of Kinnock and Blair and so on, but an ascendant tendency rises to the top and reshapes the Labour Party in its interest and in the pursuit of a broader project. And this is not done by means of conciliation. This is done by means of political debate, yes, but also a political struggle within the party. And in the aftermath of the 2017 election, when the leadership pursued, you know, this idea that it was a government in waiting because the 2017 election had gone so well, Leo was absolutely correct to say that that was the moment that the political capital should have been used. Instead of saying, oh, you know, the 2017 election shows how great it is when everyone's on the same team, the instinct should have been there on the Labour left to say, no, 2017 was the moment, the high point of the Corbyn project, and it needed to be used to push forward a much bolder reform of the party that would have, you know, structurally embedded socialist politics in the Labour Party for years to come, in a way that it hasn't been, and that we're now on the retreat, and so much of what we gained over 5 years was gone in 5 months. You know, I think Leo was completely correct on that. I also think some of the other points that he made historically, actually, not even about the Corbyn project, but when you look back over his writing, when he talked about the problem of the Labour left being focused on winning government, not winning power, and not being able to separate those two in their understandings. That definitely repeated itself again in the Corbyn project, unfortunately. The focus on party battles to the exclusion of social ones, the fact that so little conversation was devoted in the past 5 years to reviving the trade union movement and workers' struggle, to the fact that really there was no concurrent increase in worker militancy alongside an ascendancy of a socialist leader, the leadership of the Labour Party. That problem was not seen to be as significant as it truly was, because so much focus was placed on party battles. And Leo said another thing, which I won't here endorse or disagree with, but I think it's an interesting quote. And he says, in one of his pieces, he says, "I think the terrible conclusion one has to draw is that you cannot change these parties," which he means the centre-left social democratic parties, into socialist parties without splitting them apart. And this is something the right has always known in the Labour Party. It's one of the reasons why the Labour Party is right now trying to purge us all. And it's something that the Labour Party is too often not learned, because, as Leo correctly said, taking from Miliband again, that the burden of unity in the party has always fallen on the left and not on the right. But there are broader points that to Leo's work that I'd like to just run through a little bit before I come to a conclusion. One of the things that influenced me most about Leo, and I was speaking a little bit to Sam Gindin by email earlier today, Leo and Sam's book, In the Making of Global Capitalism, was a tremendously influential book on me because of when it came out, because I was only, in my early 20s, and I was facing the context of this aftermath of a financial crisis. I was living in Ireland at the time, and we were obviously facing the realities of the Troika and this new austerity program that was sweeping Europe. And I was trying to understand the connections between, globalization, the role of the state, and so much of that austerity period was framed, and there are certain, justifications for it, you can understand why, as a question of public versus private, and the state versus the market. And what Leo and Sam did in that 2013 book, Making Global Capitalism, was to lay out their thesis, which is absolutely correct, that the state and the market are directly and intimately related, because the same class that controls the market with its ownership of the wealth also rules and runs the state, and it uses the state to structure the broader economy in its interests. And that this is something that it had done consistently. This is something that it had done throughout the process, particularly of globalization. It explains so much about, how the American state in particular, and he talked about the kind of the soft power of the American empire, but he did talk about it as an informal empire in that book, how it had shaped post-war Europe through the Marshall Plan, not only in order to kind of suit its immediate interests, but because the American capitalist class understood their role as shepherds of the entire global system. That unlike the German capitalist class, which might have understood itself as a shepherd in Europe, and unlike the Japanese capitalist class, which might have had a perspective for parts of Asia, the only one that really understood its role as a genuinely international shepherd of the capitalist system was the American capitalist class, and that it worked to create a European terrain that was friendly to its interests. And there are very many examples. Like I said, the shaping of the Marshall Plan, the building of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the framework that surrounded that, and examples that myself and Leo would have talked about, which were relevant actually to the Labour left. Key moments that are forgotten to history in many respects now. Things like the Nenni telegram was a really fascinating and important example of this. When there was an intervention, the Labour left MPs lined up to support Pietro Nenni, who had been a partisan leader in Italy, as he tried to build a post-war government which united the socialists and the communists. And the intervention came down extremely heavily from the British security state, with the pressure of the Americans, to basically build a cordon sanitaire around the idea of working with any communist party in any part of Europe. And there was this threat to expel en masse the the Labour left MPs, and in the end, most of the Labour left MPs withdrew their names from the support in that telegram, and they were cowed really for a number of years afterwards. And so there were key moments at which the American capitalist class and the American political elite intervened to structure post-war European politics. And you know, this was something that Leo and Sam talked about extremely compellingly in that book. They go forward into you know, the role and the crisis of the 1970s that US-backed institutions play. They talk about the Herstatt Bank collapse in Germany in 1974. Where the German government were quite prepared to allow the bank go to the wall, but they came under pressure from the Bank for International Settlements, which was an American-backed project, to prop up the bank with a bailout in order to sustain the global financial system, because they were worried about contagion. They talk about the crisis of the 1970s in Britain, and particularly the intervention of the IMF and the whole debate that followed around that in the Labour Party in 1976, when you know, the IMF gave its loan with these conditions of wage restraint and budget cuts, all of which were met, even though the vast majority of the loan never reached the British government. But this was all a part of trying to intervene to structure the kind of European social democratic projects in the aftermath of that crisis. And also how they influenced, you know, the development of the European Union. That from quite an early stage, going back to Schuman and Monnet, but obviously very particularly in the aftermath of the 70s, and with the development with Jacques Delors, the Single European Act, and so on, the need to bring in American-style open markets through the four freedoms, which were codified into the European constitutional framework. And they, you know, Leo was very critical, of course, and this is one of the points at which I think we had the greatest agreement. He was very critical of the British left's approach to the European Union, because he saw accurately, very astutely, and very early on, actually, in his writing, how much the British left was attempting to use Europe as a shield to protect itself from its own defeats. And so while Thatcher was on the rise, instead of focusing on rebuilding class institutions and organization and a politics that could defeat Thatcherism, too much of the British left had sought savior from Europe, and from a kind of social Europe that was always a chimera. Leo quite correctly compared the response of these British left-wing figures to people like the Swedish right, who understood around about the same time, when the push was coming on from the Swedish business confederations to join the European Union, that the European Union could be used as not a means to protect the welfare state in the most advanced welfare state in the world, but the means to dismantle it. And he was quite correct in saying that the right of the Swedish politics and the Swedish ruling class understood the European project far better than the British left. But there was a lot. I'll finish up on a final point, which I think is really important with Leo, because it's something too few people do these days. When Leo was talking about all of these questions, the role of the state, the question of the Labour Party, and so on, he was talking about it from class perspective. Even when he spoke about the role that the particularly American empire played in shaping the global economy, he spoke about it as a class project of the American ruling class in order to sustain a global system which was in the end to their interests. And he understood that there was a kind of interrelation, or a term that he used, interpenetration of these different ruling class interests, that there was some degree of autonomy, of course, for different fractions of the European ruling classes, but that there needed to be this broader structural influence. And he always took class politics seriously. It was always something that was at the core of Leo Panitch's work. And when his book, one of his most interesting books, when he wrote about From Consent to Coercion, and the project of reshaping the Canadian labour laws, which obviously was so close to home for him. For a lot of us, and the British left today, Canada and its labour laws might be quite distinct, but the truth of it is, so much of what he wrote about in that book was relevant internationally. He talked about some really interesting questions, the way in which the class compromise era had been characterized by a kind of consent between, as part of this pact, where basically reforms were done very often through negotiation with trade union leaderships, and trade union leaderships acted to as a cap at times on the militancy of parts of their workforce, to the point of coercion after the 70s and 80s, where in Canada it was back to work legislation in particular that was used so often to force the end of strikes through state intervention. He talked about the different kind of theses that existed amongst trade union leaderships for understanding the world of globalization, and this kind of partnership internationalism, which he talked about on the one hand, which was this belief that you could have a kind of international corporatist framework, which would produce Keynesian or neo-Keynesian policies through an agreement between business and labor around the world, which has influenced, I think, quite a lot of leading figures in places like the ILO and in international trade union organizations. He spoke about, the limits and the failures of that. And on the other hand, spoke about progressive competitiveness and the idea of, each state competing with one another in order to try to raise the standards. And that this was also a strong thesis which informed a lot of, for example, the German trade union leadership, something which was very important in structuring the European project. This belief that you could have this virtuous cycle of competition between states in order to raise industrial and labor standards. And he also spoke, which was another interesting thing and a real challenge, I think, to those of us who are interested in class politics today, about the difficulties of working class respectability politics. And how much they played a role. The idea that, layers of the class could gain access to a somewhat better life, and that without the horizon of a broader project and without institutions capable of involving people in that project and involving them in the access of power and democratic power over their own lives, that more and more working class people would begin to see for themselves places within the system, and as he spoke about, some small tax break from a right-wing government as more significant than the gains of the welfare state in terms of accessing the kind of better quality of life that they might have aspired towards. And also that there would be a tendency to be able to create these deep and very damaging fissures within the class on all kinds of bases, where you would be able to turn people who had some degree of integration into the capitalist state against those who are less integrated and more able to, and more likely to sustain the worst of cutbacks. And that the only way to overcome this, which was the fundamental question of Leo Panitch's work, I think, was workers' power, was the ability to construct political projects in such a way that they could aspire towards taking power in society, not just through some party elite, not through a trade union leadership, but through workers themselves in the places that they worked, in the communities that they lived in, and then through transforming the state as a vehicle for the exercise of workers' power. And I think that is the lasting contribution of Leo Panitch, is to keep that star on our horizon. It seems a very long way off now, but less far away than it did 10 years ago. And I know in Leo's final years, he was very happy to see, even though our projects were defeated from Labour and Corbyn to Bernie to Syriza, Podemos and all the rest. Even though our projects were defeated, he was enthused by the fact that the fight had been waged for the first time in decades. And he believed that the generations that were shaped by those defeats could learn the lessons of them. And I think that's the onus on all of us now, is to learn those lessons.
I think that's beautifully put, and that captures a lot of Leo's work. So, Max, before I wrap up, I wanted to just see if you wanted to chime in or mention anything else.
Yeah, no, Roman, I think you put all of that across incredibly well. You summed up exactly what Leo stood for. You know, I think Leo believed in socialism because democracy demands socialism and socialism demands democracy. And those two were intrinsically linked. One could not occur without the other. And that's just the final point I wanted to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to reiterate something that we all brought up, but I think doesn't emphasize enough. I mean, we've been talking a lot about Leo's work. I think he would want it that way. But Leo, the man, was really an incredible human being. He had a wonderful relationship with his wife Melanie of many decades. His two children, his grandchildren. He just radiated a humanity, and he made connections with everyone around him. I was lucky enough to go to a conference in his honor when he was retired at York University, and it was just beautiful to see all those people. I did feel a little bit less unique once you find out how many mentees Leo did have. It was so nice for him to have that moment of seeing the work of all these people that he inspired. So basically, instead of just talking about Leo's work, people kind of presented their own works, building off of the foundations that he had given them, which I think was incredibly nice. I can't help but think that we're in just a new cycle or a new moment. And it's not just the last 10 years where you could say that there was a cycle of struggle that began with Occupy, that continued through these creation and expansion of the new parties of the European left, with the Corbyn project, with the Sanders project. No doubt that was a cycle, which is at its end, I believe. And now we kind of are beginning a new one. But I do think there's a broader challenge to our politics coming from the fact that the working class has never been more fragmented than it is now in many decades. So a lot of the foundations upon which we based our politics now I don't think are fundamentally it means it's bunk. I don't think we should go about abandoning the working class subject or Marxism. But I think at a political level, we need to begin this project of working class reformation. And I think Leo's interest in recent years in these electoral challenges, especially if you compare it to his work from the 70s and 80s, I think his interest in these challenges was about how do you spark this project of class reformation. And I think that's our challenge. That's what we're taking a part in. And it feels awful to have to engage in these intellectual and political challenges without the services of Leo Panitch and all that he had to offer. But we have each other. I know that's a cliche, but we have each other, and we have all the people who are watching this, and the millions of more comrades who are still committed to the dream of a socialist world, a dream of a world without the exploitation of person by person, without oppression. I mean, this is what Leo devoted his life to, and the struggle continues because it must, like Max said, it absolutely must. And on that somewhat, I guess, depressing but still optimistic note, I think we should wrap up. I know it's midnight for Max and Ronan, but thank you both for on this very difficult day, joining us, and thank you for everyone for watching, and obviously we'll have a lot more coverage, longer form work on Leo's life and legacy, and hopefully new original intellectual contributions in the spirit of his work in the coming months.
Thank you for having me, Bhaskar.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. And listen, we all, I think, hope that we find our way to be as influential and as generous a spirit as Leo was as we move on in the movement. People like this, people playing the role that Leo did, they're necessary, because otherwise the lessons of one generation don't pass to the next. And that was his most important contribution.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Just one final thought based on what you were saying, Bhaskar, about how surprising it was to you about how many mentees he had. I don't know about you, but I think because of the way Leo treated people as human beings, you always felt like he was just yours. And that was why when, after he died and looking on social media and seeing, thousands and thousands of posts by and hundreds of posts by people saying, he helped me with this, he helped me with that, da, 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 da. And it just shocked me. And I don't know why it shocked me, but it was just like, I knew he was this, renowned intellectual figure, and yet at the same time, he was just our mate.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate everyone for watching this feed. Please pick up Leo's books, read them. Share them with your friends. Steal the PDFs from Verso. They're not digital right managed. Leo would be fine with you emailing them to your friends. Spread it far and wide. Print them out. Leave them at local Kinkos. Do all of that, and we'll continue on. But yeah, take care, guys.